Thank you for coming. My name is John Harper. I'm Professor Emeritus of American Foreign Policy. For many years, I was a resident professor here at the center. And it's a great pleasure to have on his first visit to Bologna, Professor Jussi Hanhimäki. Jussi is Professor of International History and Politics and the Chair of the Department of International History and Politics at the Graduate Institute of International and Development Studies in Geneva. And Jussi, I know his work well as a Cold War historian. He's internationally known as a scholar of the Cold War and US foreign policy. He's the co-editor with Odd Arne Westad, another important scholar of the Cold War, of the Cold War, A History in Documents and Eyewitness Accounts, which is extremely useful to me and many other students of the Cold War. He is a biographer of Henry Kissinger. He has written one of the most important biographies of Henry Kissinger. And Jussi's title is The Flawed Architect, Henry Kissinger and American Foreign Policy. His other books include International History of the 20th Century and Beyond, The Rise and Fall of Détente, American Foreign Policy and the Transformation of the Cold War, The United Nations, A Very Short Introduction, and most recently, Pax Transatlantica, America and Europe in the Post-Cold War Era. Of course, his talk tonight will be drawing on the insights of that book. Last but not least, let me mention a recent article that Jussi has written, Just Symbolic, ? Sport as a Barometer of International Relations. And I suppose you would be open to taking questions on that subject, if there are any. Looks like it came out just in time for the World Cup last December. Let me also mention, I should have mentioned this first, something about his academic career. He has been a lecturer at the London School of Economics, a fellow at the Woodrow Wilson Center for Scholars in Washington, a very prestigious center in Washington. He was a recipient of the 2002 Bernath Prize from the Society for Historians of American Foreign Relations. And last but not least, in 2006, he was elected Finland Distinguished Professor by the Academy of Finland, which is a title he will hold for life. And I guess I don't need to tell you where Jussi comes from, a country which is now on the front lines and which we read about in the papers every day. So Jussi, thank you very much for coming. The floor is yours. And we look forward to your talk. The title of Jussi's talk is The West is Back Again. I guess you can see it up there. Transatlantic Relations and the Ukraine War. And what you see there is actually the front cover of Jussi's recent book.
Great, thanks.
So let me mention one more thing to people. Sorry, we do have people listening online, at least so we're told. And we will be taking your questions, and I hope that I will be able to see them and figure out how to repeat them to the speaker on your behalf. So Jussi, over to you.
Yeah, that's what I thought. So thank you so much, John. It's a great pleasure. Actually, my second time in Bologna, very first time here at SAIS. So that's the thing. Yeah, at least we didn't get to my high school diploma and results, but thank you very much. Very kind. No, that's I love hearing about myself. It's all right. So thank you very much for that really nice introduction. John, of course, has been to Geneva, where I teach now, but it's been I think this is our reunion after 20 years or so. So it's great to see. It's payback time. Yeah, finally, there you go. So yeah, I'm going to talk, I hope, for maybe like half hour or so, because it's always much more fun to then engage, right? Like John said, so the title is "The West is Back Again," and I think that's the real point of the one of the main points of my talk, which is, on one hand, it's relation to those of you who recall this is ancient history now, but two years ago, Joe Biden, when elected and then assumed office, he said America is back, as you perhaps recall. And since last year, it seems, since the invasion by Russia of Ukraine, it's quite clear that the West, the NATO alliance, and so forth, is back in terms of being united against the security concern, an existential, if you will, but the security concern which is presented by the Russian invasion. Now, why again is simply because this is not the first time that the West is being declared as having finally come back again. It's something that during the Donald Trump presidency, among other things, of course, NATO was called obsolete several times by the president. He was then declared brain dead. NATO was brain dead by the French president, Emmanuel Macron at one point, and so forth. So, and yet now it seems that the West is more united, NATO is more united than ever, and of course, potentially expanding to a couple of countries, one of them being my very own Finland. So, so there is been a sort of very quick turnaround as a consequence of, in part, it seems, of the invasion of Ukraine. Why again? Again, because it's not the first time that we've seen a transatlantic crisis when NATO has been declared obsolete, when economic relations have created a crisis, when an American president has said some nasty things about Europeans and vice versa. But this is actually a recurring theme, it seems to me, since the end of World War II, but certainly in terms of the post Cold War era. And so that's the again in the title. And so what I was going to very quickly, I have a couple of slides, and let's see if this guy works. Uh-huh. I just do it like that.
Yeah, no, you can click now.
Can I do it? Okay. Okay. Well, there we go. And just to go back a few years, not very long, but a couple of quotes to get us going. Demoralized, decadent, deflating, demographically challenged, divided, disintegrating, dysfunctional, declining. That is the state of the West today. So that's 5 years ago. Bill Emmett in a book called Fate of the West. And just a couple of years after that, in 2020, for more than 70 years, the Transatlantic Alliance has served as the unshakable foundation of European stability and underpin the values of the US-led Western order. In 2020 appears that the relationship being rethought on both sides of the Atlantic. That's from everybody's favorite news outlet, CNN. So, and that again, this sort of seems to underscore the transatlantic relationship. Just a few years ago, major crisis, seemed everything was going to the proverbial hell in the handbasket, and soon enough there would be no NATO, and there would be a total transatlantic crisis. It's something that certainly in the last 30 years has been very much a recurring theme in transatlantic relations. And there is the idea that, in fact, the end of the Cold War created a new type of system in which the transatlantic relationship that for 4 decades or so was sort of the bedrock of international relations no longer really mattered. That there was a golden age before this for transatlantic relations, the Cold War, when the West was the West. today we're not quite sure what the West really is, if such a term should ever be even used again. But there's some questions as to, well, what do we understand by the West, since we don't quite know what we understand by the East. And maybe we just talk about North and South and add global to those terms, and everything is fine. Of course, it is, however, the idea of the West, the term West is thrown around quite liberally, without necessarily there being a major conceptual understanding of what that means. But if we go back to the Cold War, of course, there was a West. The West that came together for things like the Marshall Plan, of course, the NATO alliance, and ultimately freedom, right? And that, of course, is the time cover from the Berlin Wall in 1989, and that sort of historically speaking, the memory about the United West, the West that won the Cold War, is something that I think has lived on and shapes many of these debates and these concerns in particular about the other disrepaired states of the so-called West in the post-Cold War era. And that through globalization and so forth, the rise of China, what have you, there's been a whole, and then ultimately through domestic politics that disrupt or have the potential of disrupting patterns of cooperation and so forth. You've come to the state where the transatlantic relations of the West perhaps no longer really existed until February 24th, 2022. But of course, the Cold War wasn't quite such a golden age. And that's the again, going back to the again in the title of the talk, that I play this, I teach a course sometimes on transatlantic relations, and in the first class we do some quotes, and I ask students to date them. And it depends a little bit when I'm doing it, but this is one fun quote. It's the profound shift is taking place in relations between the United States and Western Europe. But those who would assume that the achievement of a moderate world order depends on some sort of working cooperation in the Atlantic area, the implications of the change are deeply disturbing. Now that could fit, I think, almost any period in the post-Cold War era. It comes from 1973, which Henry Kissinger mentioned earlier, famously called the Year of Europe, and created a whole negative reaction in Europe by saying that. But this is the year in which, of course, Great Britain joined the European Economic Community, something that has been reversed in the fairly recent past. And the idea that Europe was emerging as a rival for the United States became quite common in the 1970s. The point is that this, I like to still call it transatlantic community, or the West. This 1973 was not even the first of the many crises in transatlantic relations. Then if you go back to the 1950s, of course, we can think of the Suez crisis, or 1960s, think about Charles de Gaulle and France sort of leaving NATO. The 1970s, 1980s, Ronald Reagan and all that. Just there's been a recurrent set of tensions over subsidies, agricultural subsidies being the most famous set of these subsidies. The transatlantic relationship has, ever since World War II, in fact, been in a kind of a crisis, in a sort of constant recurring set of trade spats and concerns about differing concepts about security, and then all this driven by the advantages that politicians in democratic societies can gain by painting somebody out there as being the enemy, the boogeyman, so to speak. So there's in that sense nothing new, it seems to me. of the crisis we saw in the last few years under the Trump presidency and all the rest. However, of course, the post-Cold War has been a different kind of roller coaster for transatlantic relations, and here's just the issues seem to have multiplied and come at an increasing velocity to create tensions between United States and Europe, whether it's trade tariffs, whether it's different conceptions about what the Iran nuclear deal should contain, whether it's questions about NATO enlargement and so forth, whether it's the Paris Climate Accord, etc., etc. Of course, COVID, the World Health Organization, all of these things that are somewhat more recent could be added to that. Then, of course, we've had the Iraq War in the early 2000s and questions about the U.S. sort of overtly muscular policies in the Middle East that in the decade following September 11th. There's been endless negotiation about the subsidies given to Boeing and Airbus, and then it's created a creative tension between America and the United States and the European Union in particular. So it's been one part of the transatlantic story. In other words, whether it's the Cold War, whether it's the post-Cold War, is pretty bad. It's conflict after conflict. But none of those conflicts in the end, and that's the other point, and that's again in the title, is that none of these crises have actually made a lasting imprint in terms of the overall relations, the overall transatlantic relations, whether it's the security aspects of that relationship, what I like to call the security space, the transatlantic security space, whether it's the economic aspects, the economic space in transatlantic relationships, in transatlantic relations, and then, of course, the more tricky one, which is the democracy, politics, which means that many of those issues, however, because they carry so much potential cachet in domestic politics, there are votes in attacking France or in attacking the United States, potentially. So those things keep this notion, this sort of crisis mentality, very much alive. So, in any case, so sort of a reality check, what I call the transatlantic security space. Within all that crisis, within that sort of across all those conflicts, we have what is sometimes called history's most successful military alliance, NATO, which has continued to expand, enlarge, even during the Trump presidency, when it was declared obsolete by the American president. Actually happened is Montenegro, and then after North Macedonia joined the military alliance. So enlargement continued despite the disparaging rhetoric that you would hear from the White House. Today, of course, we perhaps will see this year, maybe, perhaps, might happen, Finland and Sweden, or maybe just Finland, joining NATO, depending on the internal, and depending largely on Turkey's decision and decisions on the matter. But the enlargement continues to the present. So there is a transatlantic security space. It has become increasingly large in terms of, particularly obviously on the European side. But of course that creates its own problems for the alliance. It's hard to see that US security concerns are identical to those of North Macedonia, or that that Finland, if it joins, has the sort of similar security concerns as Portugal. These sorts of things are obviously beyond the sort of beyond control, but overall the clear direction is, and it's been somehow helped by the Russian reminder since February 24th, 2022, why we have NATO in the first place. So now, in addition to there's the security space, there is the transatlantic economic space. And one thing about the transatlantic economic space is that despite China's rise, American decline, the transatlantic economic space, by which I mean roughly North America, United States and Canada, and the European Union, plus today the UK, Switzerland, and the smaller countries of the EFTA group. This is remains the world's wealthiest space, economically speaking. It is also the world's most connected intercontinental economic space. And what's remarkable about the transatlantic economic space is it's not so much the trade in goods, which of course China today is the United States and the European Union's most important sort of source of imports when it comes down to goods. However, at the same time, the United States invests in Europe much more than it does anywhere else, and the other way around. The trade in services across the transatlantic outweighs trade in services in any other context. There is and this this comes from some of these statistics you see here come from the transatlantic economy, a survey done every year at I think it's at the Woodrow Wilson Center. It's also got an honorary mention of. So, security space very much intact, the economic space, and again here I think what we've seen in the last year as a consequence of the Russian invasion, it's created these issues about energy and energy imports, particularly in Europe from Russia. This has also driven the transatlantic economy much closer together. Of course, it is a short-term development so far. Whether it will have a long-lasting development is another question. These are, but lo and behold, the countries on both sides of the Atlantic certainly face similar economic dilemmas overall and concerns in terms of whether it's the rise of China, whether it's move away from fossil fuels to clean energy, concerns about the overdependence on oil or natural gas, particularly from Russia, but also from the Middle East. And these sort of structural economic elements clearly are keeping the transatlantic economic space together. Now, the last of the 3 points of the reality checks is the transatlantic political space, which is the most unpredictable element in all of this. Democracies, as you all know, do have elections quite often. When you put together 30+ democracies, they will have every year there will be at least 1 or 2 elections somewhere in the transatlantic political space. In recent years, the politics on both sides of the Atlantic has been very much dominated by populism. I mean, that's the number one news item in most contexts. And it's raised a lot of concerns about the possibility that, in fact, democracy might just go off the rails, that we would have strong men. Here's a couple of examples of 2 men trying to make a comeback in the near future. I doubt either will be very successful, but you never know. But what we've seen is the sort of rise of populism, not only in the United States or in Great Britain, but in Finland. We have the true Finns, in Italy, the Liga, in, you name it, in France, the Popular Front, and so on and so forth. So you've had clearly a rise in these types of populist movements and parties, and some gain power, perhaps only briefly, others somewhat longer, as is the case with Viktor Orbán in Hungary. But clearly, the sort of direction of travel in that sense has been very, very obvious in the 2010s, at least. That's to many disturbing, but it also, I think, it says one or two things about the transatlantic relationship and what I call a transatlantic political space. If we see similar trends in North America, in Europe, that to me at least, it seems to tell me that, well, people are voting for similar reasons. And therefore there is something that connects the two sides of the Atlantic. You may not like that connection particularly much, but similar concerns. It doesn't necessarily mean that democracy is dying. After all, populism, the very word populism, does not necessarily imply the end of democracy or anything like that. But it certainly implies that there is a great deal of debate, that there is that most of the transatlantic space is in a cusp of something that is in some ways renegotiating some or starting to renegotiate the legacies of the Cold War, which left a sort of non-ideological moment in both. Then when East was no longer East and West was no longer West, that those simple sort of divisions that we used to have. And of course, in Europe, it used to be across Europe very clear that there were parties on the left and parties on the right, and then a few parties in the middle. And that's the case in most countries. You don't find that similar kind of sort of inevitability in terms of how you can color the electoral map so easily anymore. So I think it's populism in some ways came in to fill the void that was left by the decline of the collapse of communism, the difficulties in maintaining hardcore left-wing parties, and at the same time, the difficulties that creates to those who define themselves in contrast to those left-wing parties. So the politics of the transatlantic political space since the end of World War II have clearly share very little resemblance in some ways to the politics of the Cold War, and that's what makes it unpredictable, and that populism, which clearly is not an easily identifiable ideology as such. I mean, if you were to find an ideology for one of these guys, I think you'd be hard pressed to sort of, other than winning elections and so forth, it might be difficult to identify them, certainly in the sort of classical left-right spectrum that we still use often to talk about politics. Okay, so then we come to the 24th of February of last year, when, of course, what happened is the Russian invasion of Ukraine, which in many ways was not a surprise to many observers. The United States was warning about this is going to happen. Just wait till the Olympics are over and something bad's going to happen. It has obviously created new momentum for the for the enlargement of NATO in particular. Finland and Sweden are likely. Well, there's a great deal of support within those countries for NATO membership. So the existential type of security threats that were there, somewhat hidden, but of course had been building up since 2014 when Russia had annexed Crimea already. And there you see in the middle the Finnish foreign minister, and on the right the Swedish foreign minister in Madrid last year. So the point about this is that going back, NATO enlargement, of course, has a long history going back to the 1950s, in fact, when West Germany joined NATO and so forth. And it is something that continues some 70 years later. It is in this case, yes, propelled by a specific event, which is the Russian invasion of Ukraine. But at the same time, it is because NATO, I think for most countries that are part of NATO, is not just a security alliance. It is something more than that. That it seems to be an enduring part of the transatlantic relationship. So so we can get to the question. I'm gonna see if I have some takeaways. So just to basically to sum up, transatlantic. It's very much a sort of roller coaster ride of ups and downs, and it's a constant roller coaster ride of ups and downs. It's been there not only since the end of the Cold War, but already throughout the Cold War. You know, great deal of tensions, whether it was in NATO, about out of area questions, could have been the Suez crisis, could have been Vietnam War. Later on, of course, in the post-Cold War era, about Iraq, Afghanistan, and so forth. It's been a roller coaster ride ever since World War II. It relates to the economic area or the economic space in terms of the various bats about tariffs and trade. There's been, however, a general move towards further Atlantic integration, but no big, no EU-like integration deal, and I think that's very unlikely to happen anytime in the near future. That the transatlantic free trade area notions are likely to be much more piecemeal than the creation, say, of the European Union, and yet the direction of travel is clearly there. It's going to be tensions. There's always been tensions about this, because in most trade deals there are winners and losers. And especially if it comes at the cost of, say, cutting down subsidies for agriculture at home, then that has a political implication, again, in democracies, that can be very difficult for governments to sustain. The fundamentals of the transatlantic relationship remain strong. Had I said this 3 years ago, people would have questioned this quite a lot. Now it's easy to say this because of Ukraine, because it seems to be a united front in terms of Ukraine. I would, though, and the security space is intact. Now there will be tensions. There always have been there. The united front that was there a year ago in the immediate aftermath of the start of the Russian invasion, you've already seen some cracks in that. Some difficult discussions about which country will support Ukraine and in what way, for example. That is an ongoing negotiation process among NATO allies. But at the same time, NATO is in the process of yet another enlargement. So the direction of travel seems quite clear. The transatlantic economic space is, it seems to me, close, if not closer than it was certainly 3 or 4 years ago. and the political space, I would argue that in the end, the idea of participatory democracy remains very much alive. The events in Ukraine have, I think, created a broader discussion about the importance of holding on to democracy and what it means in terms of security, as well as anything else. But it remains unpredictable. And we don't know who's going to win the next US election, and whether it matters all that much in terms of the transatlantic relationship. Because the doomsayers about Donald Trump, clearly, you can now go back and speculate, well, if he had 4 more years, then it's all gone, dreadfully down and so forth. Possibly, but we don't know. And we never will, it seems. So that's the point. And the conclusion, the transatlantic relationship is an interesting mix of, on the one hand, there's clearly a community that's underpinned by institutions like NATO, underpinned by close economic relations that have been developed over decades, underscored by broadly similar institutions in terms of democracy. Of course, there are differences in the two-party systems in the US and the UK, as opposed to multi-party systems in countries like Italy or France or Finland. Yet, it is participatory democracy, elective politics that rules. And yet, conflict is inevitable. Conflict is inevitable in the political space within. Of course, it thrives on conflict. You can't win an election without sort of antagonizing somebody, and so forth. And when you have a group of 30 plus democracies who have disagreements within themselves, and then likely to have slightly different interests when it comes down to questions of security and economics, of course you're going to have conflict. The interesting thing, though, that as I'm a historian, when looking at how the conflict versus the community aspects, the sort of sustained common interest and so forth, that you can clearly see underpin the transatlantic relations. For historians, for political scientists, IR theorists and so forth, community is not interested. Cooperation is not all that interesting. Conflict is what thrives scholarship in the end. Which is why if you go to your local library downstairs and you look up transatlantic relationship, you will find that most titles will have crisis, conflict, or something like that appended to the description of transatlantic relations in the this, that, or the other. And that, that also, I think, that is partly responsible for the fact that we often have the perception that there is a crisis. Even today, whenever somebody coughs and says, well, we're not going to send any tanks to Ukraine after all, that's the headline, not the fact that there is actually a strong support in terms of the war in Ukraine. So that is, I think it's natural, but it is also something that you can easily see has given a certain color to our understanding of the transatlantic relationship. Now I'm going to closing with 2 quotes from 2 gentlemen seen here, Zbigniew Brzezinski and Henry Kissinger. This is the last time they were together in 2016. But the quotes go back a long time. And Brzezinski in the late 1960s, and Brzezinski says that both of these guys, of course, are Europeans transplanted to America. One from Poland, the other from Germany. So we have the quintessential European Americans, both of whom served as national security advisors in the 1970s. Kissinger also, of course, as Secretary of State. and so forth. But I think these quotes sort of capture the many dilemmas or the basic dilemmas in terms of transatlantic relations. That, as Brzezinski puts it, discussion with the Europeans of our concepts and proposal for common initiatives will help revitalize Atlantic ties and revive the feeling of interdependence with America. So instrumentalizing this whole thing. But we should not fear provoking occasionally a lively controversy. A spirited dialogue is preferable to a quiet divorce. So that's sort of advice to any couple having issues, but also I think sort of good advice in terms of relations among democracies, which is what we're talking about. And then Kissinger, of course, in his sort of realpolitik context says, how much unity should we want? How much diversity can we stand? Adjusting the balance between integration and autonomy will be the key challenge for transatlantic relations. And I think that's what it is. That's what it's always been. It's likely to remain that way despite this moment of unity that we've seen in the last year in terms of the reaction to events in the Ukraine. There will be another crisis. There will be another conflict that will be probably thrown out of all proportion at some point or another, and will be made use of by politicians on both sides of the Atlantic to gain some extra votes, some extra exposure, and so I leave you with that, and I say thank you, grazie, and I hope we can have some questions.
Thank you very much, Jussi. I think there's a lot of food for thought there. One thing I'll mention is that Jussi himself didn't point out is that this very optimistic analysis, in a way, that's what it is, it seems to me, stressing the continuity. It's crisis prone, but it's basically, it's fundamentally robust, this transatlantic community. I mean, the book that you wrote making this argument came out well before the beginning of the Ukraine war. So it's a pre-Ukraine, in a sense, the Ukraine war has, you could argue, is evidence, provides only additional evidence for the thesis that he had already developed to a surprising degree. And just one last point, and then I'll open it up. One could also argue that Ukraine may be the source of another fundamental crisis. I mean, how the war ends and on what terms could well be a crisis lurking that and also already emerging both within the United States and between the United States and various members of NATO. But maybe that's something that you would like to address later, the implications of the Ukraine war. But shall we open it up for questions? Anyone would like to start? I see Professor Mark Gilbert. Not sure that's working, Mark.
Shall I?
Go ahead.
Okay, so the easy one first. No, there's no. You're not the first one to notice, and it's that there was no pre-thought in that. But yes, it's the Anglos dominate, and I guess that's. I mean, I guess it's sort of a reflection of one part of the transatlantic relationship, which is NATO. Then definitely, yeah. So of the two questions, might next time be different? Of course, you never know. Whether, however, so historian one sort of looks at patterns, and the pattern is that yes, there is bound to be a crisis. There's bound to be differences, and yet most likely, statistically, they've always been sorted out, so to speak. So if you think about, I mean, you're absolutely right. The Ukraine, and what John said about Ukraine, and is that going to be another crisis in the lurking? Oh yes, it's already taking shape in some ways. Discussions about, well, should Ukraine really win? Is that not going to create another catastrophic situation? What if Russia and enters into some kind of an internal situation that is unpalatable, almost like a civil war or something. So all of these things, of course, are creating debates within the alliance that are likely to split it into two in terms of those who want to find a diplomatic way out, even at the cost of, I don't know, some parts of Ukrainian territory, and others who disagree. And most likely, I mean, that this a lot will depend ultimately, I think, on the United States, on where that's, because the United States in the end is the key power in terms of the military assistance given to Ukraine today, despite Germany, of course, becoming suddenly much more aggressive. It's maybe not the right word, but as you know, much more military assistance than ever before. I'm not confident that the idea of a European Union as a security actor in its own right is going to take on anytime soon, in part because divisions among the Europeans about this. Many Europeans who actually like the fact that the United States is a European power when it comes down to security. And since it is the past pattern, I think there is a certain comfort in always repeating this the past. In terms of democracies, this is an endless. I mean, the United States democracy has always been somewhat different from that we see here in Europe. In part because it's part of it is just in the electoral system. It's first past the poll, so that the nuance is out the window. The nuance has to be negotiated within the parties themselves. And so that creates an immediate polarization in the U.S. political system, as it does in the UK political system as well. So it's not unique in that sense. Whether that makes has somehow gotten worse over time is, of course, debatable. I think there's what I think we saw in 2020 in the United States is the sort of very strong reaction to Trump as a sort of as an enemy of the liberal world order and what have you. And I think that is a signal of the fact that particular negotiation is going to continue in the United States, as it does in Europe. We do have extreme wings of or extreme parties in that sense that are somewhat comparable to the one part of the Republican Party that you referred to. That if it's whether it's the it's not the Macrons of this world, but it's perhaps the Le Pens of this world and some parts of that political constituency. So you do see again what I was saying in the talk, which is that you see similar patterns. They're not necessarily comforting patterns, but they are similar. Despite the somewhat different political systems that we have. So, yeah. In what sense? Mm-hmm. 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 Yeah. So I think, I mean, broadly speaking, NATO enlargement is become very controversial in recent years, and it seems to me that we can understand NATO enlargement without understanding, obviously, the end of the Cold War and so forth. And what you really see is the sort of historical memories being debated and renegotiated in the last 20, 30 years in Eastern Europe in particular. And the question about whether NATO enlargement is a push eastwards by an alliance, a military alliance, with some form of a aggressive design, or whether it's an invitation. And that's the old debate that some historians have been having about why did the United States become a European power? Was it because it's an empire and imperialistic, or is it because the actors in the European continent saw some important benefits from having the United States play an important role? I think you've seen that also take place in the context of NATO enlargement, but it's mixed with the simultaneous process of EU enlargement, which I don't think we can divorce the two. It's very difficult to divorce the two. Now, as a consequence, obviously, what's happened is that if we look at the center point of Europe, in terms of the European Union, that has moved eastwards. And you're absolutely right to say that, yes, at the same time, the wealth hasn't moved that much eastwards, right? So what's that going to do in terms of how shall I put, the security? I think it's what all of this has done in effect. It has raised the importance that many traditional wealthy West European powers, and I think the Ukraine crisis is a sort of another part of this story. That moving, it's sort of the wealth in Western Europe still depends largely on security of the European Union as a whole. So it sort of automatically, while Germany started supporting Ukraine very rapidly, I think what we've seen is that saying that there's a process by which because the center of gravity, because with each enlargement, the security concerns slightly change. So you want to make sure, and the security concerns are connected to the economic concerns. So I'm not sure if I'm answering your question very clearly, but I think it sort of clearly has meant that let me put it this way. In terms of the US history, there's this big debate about sort of forward security, right, being one of the big themes. Forward security, meaning that once technology made it clear that you couldn't rely on the two oceans anymore to provide security necessarily, then you had to start having military bases and whatnot all around the world. in a sort of smaller way, I think what seen in terms of the countries like Germany is that Poland has become the frontier in terms of theirs, Germany's security as a consequence of NATO enlargement and the virtually simultaneous EU enlargement. And that means that that there is a strong incentive to also support both the security aspect, but also the economic development of Poland. So yeah, no, but it's a good question. I think
I'll take a question that's come in from an online viewer. Professor Dana Allen is asking you, who basically he agrees with the thrust of your argument, but what happens if Ukraine starts to lose the war or loses it? And could I add my own question to that? What is, assuming that a decisive defeat of Russia is unlikely. I mean, we're not going to be marching to Moscow. I don't think Crimea, I think Crimea would prove to be a bridge too far. Assuming that you can't decisively defeat Russia, what is the best outcome for the transatlantic community? I mean, if you want to hold this, this amazing progress that's been made, and if you want to preserve the robustness of this transatlantic community, what would you say is the best possible outcome for the Ukraine war that one could hope for, or that one should aim for?
So I think the two are probably not the same, in a sense that obviously the best possible outcome is that Russian troops are withdrawn from within Ukraine's borders. And as a consequence, it is clear that, what NATO countries did, what the United States did, served the purpose that it was there. It will be very important in terms of domestic politics. It will be important in terms of strengthening support for NATO as an institution, and so forth. Now, is that likely to happen? Probably not. In part because a total Russian defeat, so to speak, is very unlikely. And it would probably take a significant transformation or upheaval within Russia itself for that to happen. I think there are limits in terms of, and we've seen the negotiation of what kind of equipment can NATO provide to Ukraine over the last year. And I think they're very conscious that these will not, when a few weeks ago, Vladimir Putin said, oh, there's been a terrorist attack on Russian soil by Ukrainians and so forth. I mean, this, I think, I'm not sure how much truth there was in that, but I think that created a lot of cold feet among NATO countries in terms of, is this a sort of false flag operation aimed to enlarge the conflict? So I think in relation to Dana Allen's question about what if Ukraine loses the war, I think that is equally unlikely at this point. It could have happened, I think, a year ago, quite quickly. In principle, at least, it might have happened. And we will probably go on debating endlessly as to whether that's because the Russian military just wasn't up for it, or to these kinds of operations, or whether there were other reasons behind it. But it's very unlikely if the moment Ukraine would have lost the war was a year ago, I think, and that did not happen. I think its most likely outcome, sadly, is a protracted conflict. That a year from now, we'll probably still be talking about an unstable situation. with claims of of ownership on the part of Russia of various regions in the Ukraine, the Donbass, and so forth. The issue of Crimea is likely to be there, but it's, I think, because of the time factor, it's likely to be seen as a sort of a key demand, and what you perhaps will see is some kind of a frozen conflict. Perhaps we are heading to some kind of North versus South Korea kind of situation in which there will be no peace agreement. There will be some form of armistice, and then negotiations that will drag on for a very, very long time. Perhaps eventually solved because of domestic changes in either Russia, Ukraine, or both.
Or the United States.
Or the United States.
President Ron DeSantis, for example, I think might have a significant impact on the degree of American support for Ukraine.
Yes, it's true that yes, and I think what you likely to see is tensions within NATO itself in terms of how much support. Now, what I think that is likely to drive is a sort of on the European side, it's likely to provide incentives for a diplomatic push for some before, and that's where the the whole
Also, I think
unpredictability of politics.
Biden is subject to the same pressure.
Sure.
And I think he will make a serious effort to seek a solution before the elections. Also because it will help him if he does achieve one. Other questions out here? Alex?
This is your presentation. I wanted to ask, like, more about security, and I know while the United States is for the strongest security aspect of Europe, do you think with weapons on the border that I don't think we'll disagree regardless of the outcome of the war? Do you think we will have support in place of one security or to have it more centralized into one security instead of relying on
Right. So I think to some extent the EU is likely to, I think, create some kind of regional presence that is part military and part, and precisely I think because the concerns about the unpredictability potentially of the United States in terms of its because there's some domestic change, and then that may mean that the aid to Ukraine is suddenly halved. So I think that's likely to push the EU to, or at least certain countries within the EU, which could be France and Germany, or and perhaps the UK may come into play. Although there again, I think the distance of the conflict in some ways is significant, but it's not so. It's for Germany in particular. This has become a sort of key issue. So yeah, and Germany as the wealthiest, biggest country in the EU. Yeah. Certainly.
Alex Kaplan.
Question. Thank you very much for the presentation. I really like the thrust of the argument. I was curious because you talked about the way this community existed for a very long time with a lot of opportunities. I'm curious how you think the core is expanded. I think when you had that map in the U.S. out the window, I may not have seen it, but when you think about 1960, that image, Finland was not the core of left community. It's very much peripheral. The entire Eastern Bloc of the Warsaw Pact is not just peripheral, it's the East, the opposing. So the West has expanded to include countries 35 years ago were on the opposite side of the conflict. So that expansion, that change, and also the convergence. I mean, Sweden and Finland as core advocates who've given more military than France has, apparently. I mean, this is the correct figures. There's something very interesting that as it's expanded, the newer members, Sweden, Finland, Eastern European countries, are actually even more pro-American, as you said, more transatlantically inclined than the French are historically. They left NATO in the 60s. So as it's expanded, the West has become more engaged with America. They're more interested in playing a certain sorts of roles on the side. I mean, if you think about Iraq, the Danes and the Poles are the largest contributors. So why do you think there's such doubt from the core of it when even as it expands to Sweden and Finland, these have become even more part of the core of the West, and even more active in its security apparatus? There's this doubt, but it seems to be expanding.
So I think I mean, for Finland, Sweden, for the former Warsaw Pact countries, it's a these are countries in the last 30 years had to sort of redefine where they are on the geopolitical map. And I think a big part of the answer to your question is simply find it on the map. You know, if Finland has a 1,300-kilometer border with Russia, that makes some impact on how people think about security and so forth. And Poland with its history, the Baltic states, and so forth, countries that were at one point or another during the Cold War sort of invaded or by either Warsaw Pact or Soviet troops, whether it's Czechoslovakia, Hungary, and so forth. Obviously, there is an incentive there. So it's I mean, in some ways, it's sort of the what Donald Rumsfeld called the New Europe syndrome, in that, and these are countries that, because it's for historically speaking, they are for the first time able to tap into some of that, some of the benefits of becoming a NATO member, for example, which it's more than Article 5. It's a bunch of other things as well. But it's seen as a beneficial departure, and certainly in many cases it's seen as a significant departure from what was before. We can't understand Poland's keenness in joining NATO if you don't if you don't think about the history of Poland in the up until the 1990s, and so that's one part. For Western Europe, for the core of Europe, much of this is, I think, I mean, in part, it's a sort of legacy of decades of dealing with American power, American influence. It may be in part cultural, but of course, anti-Americanism is a well-known, well-respected phenomenon across Western Europe, and so it may, in part, just be that. It's also in part related to that whole old Europe, new Europe thing, in terms of there isn't the similar kind of, particularly when it comes down to what we call out of area issues, whether it's Iraq, and of course Iraq is a wonderful case study of how, or 9/11 is a wonderful case study of how you go from sort of massive sympathy to utter disgust in a matter of 2 years, from the post 9/11 we are all Americans and so forth, to the what the hell are you doing in Iraq, and this is the craziest thing ever. So that's the sort of, I think, in part because West Europeans have dealt with the United States in much closer terms for much longer. And also, I think, in part because the security concern, the immediate geopolitical security concerns, are becoming seemingly removed from daily reality as NATO enlarges and the European Union enlarges. The borders go far away. So what is the concern? And that is not equally, if you are in Helsinki or if you are in Estonia, and so forth. It is not, Russia is there, and that's the existential security concern. If you are in Paris, it's not there. It's far removed, and it has been far removed for a very long time.
even Switzerland is sort of lightening its
Mhm.
policy, and helping people get weapons to Ukraine.
Mhm.
And Sweden's not necessarily immediately impacted, but yet joining NATO is one of the first West. So
Mhm.
they're a country that never sent troops abroad, and now they're really much more involved in the security of these countries. That's not new Europe. Northern Europe is kind of like old Europe. But
Mhm.
there's less alternatives. It's
Mhm.
really more convergence from countries that aren't
Mhm.
big France or Italy.
Mhm. Yeah, I think, I mean, in part, it's the less alternatives. It's a reflection of the end of the Cold War. I mean, what are you neutral from? Is a good question to ask sometimes, and even in Switzerland we ask that every now and then. We don't answer it, but you know, it's asked. So, but yeah, and I think, I mean, it varies a bit from country to country. So the Finnish story is sort of neutrality forced upon Finland as a way of surviving, rather than a conscious choice or a popular choice. It did become a sort of a popular choice because over decades it seemed to work. But there's the history, there's the, you know, the geopolitical situation. So I think it is in terms of Cold War neutrality, certainly at the end of the Cold War, it just doesn't make any sense. And what you have left therefore is countries like Austria, who we have neutrality written into the constitution, and then of course Switzerland, neutrality going back so many hundreds of years that is unthinkable. And also as a sort of way of keeping the country, which is otherwise somewhat less united, linguistically and in other ways. Neutrality is one of those national myths that culturally keeps the country together. That was never the case in Finland. It's never the case not really the case. A bit more so in Sweden, perhaps, but certainly not in Finland. Neutrality carried. It was always neutrality in citation marks, in a sense that we went really neutral because it could only be neutral towards the United States, but not so much towards the Soviet Union. So it carried a different kind of baggage.
Questions? What does Finland have to fear from Russia? Come on. I'm going to ask us, this is a semi-facetious question, but given the performance of the Russian army, given that Russia has no territorial claims I mean, they took what they wanted after World War II. By the way, don't forget that Finland was an ally of Hitler, was a defeated power during World War II, and lost a chunk of territory. Sorry to remind you.
That's all right. That's right. There's a
But-
good memories, yeah.
But today, I mean, what does Finland really seriously or realistically have to fear from Russia? And is there a, as you suggested just now, is there an opposition? Are there Finns who oppose NATO membership? And what arguments are they making?
Yes, I mean, it's the last question. So there are people who oppose. It's not 100% support for this. It is, I think, the last I've seen, 65-70%. So there's a significant opposition. I think it's more about doubt. It's about the fact, well, it's basically about the fact that, well, why change something that's been working? I mean, that's one of the arguments. And isn't this going to make us less secure because then we are, at the border, and we've never been the border country of NATO. You know, Norway had a little bit up there with the Soviet Union, but Finland was sort of, and that way we kept our options open, more or less. But this is a sort of a significant departure in terms of Finnish security policy, and since World War II, which is not something that has been forgotten in many parts of Finland. I think the main thing really is again, it's the map that is concerning for many people. So when you put together the simple fact that Russia invaded Ukraine. Ukraine and Russia are neighbors. There were claims to Ukrainian territory on part of the Russian Empire. Finland was part of the Russian Empire at one point. The Soviet Union invaded Finland, and the other way around a little bit with German help, but you know, that part is rarely remembered. And so all, you know, you put together the historical memories that are still alive, and then the realities of what's going on in Ukraine, and that creates a sort of notion that, well, you know, what if you're next, right? That's the basic rationale. Now, whether realistically there's much to be feared is of course, it's probably not in the immediate future. But still, Finns are building a wall on the border, you know, asking something from an American president, and yeah, so it is. It's become, you know, the idea. It's NATO membership is taken as a foregone conclusion, and just talking about it, deciding to apply for it, it's considered, even if for whatever reason Turkey vetoes or something like that, it's not going to change in the Finnish mind. That doesn't change the fact that Russia
Doesn't change geography.
right doesn't change geography, and doesn't change the fact that Finland had clearly made a choice in this.
Okay, well, we could go on with this discussion. It would be fascinating to talk more about the Ukraine war and its implications, but it's been a very interesting and thorough tour d'horizon, as they would say in Geneva. So thank you very much, Jussi.
Thank you everybody for.
But I'm sorry to those who are watching online if I did not get to your questions. But there were a couple on European strategic autonomy, but I think that the speaker did cover those.